nightmares. Cooley, North Carolina. A tiny town in rural North Carolina, Cooley is a small and close-knit community in this southern state. Built along the South Yadkin River, the region is full of lush green trees and nature. The town shares the name with the Cooley Hill Plantation, located just 12 miles east from the town. The plantation was given this name by General Jesse A. Pearson, who owned the house and decided to name it after the Cooley, the native people who also had a village nearby Virginia. The entire town of Cooley is less than a mile large, with a small population of around 900 people. The small local economy mainly consists of manufacturing jobs and warehouse and transportation businesses to earn income. The name Cooley represents the place where the white oaks grow. December 12th, 1987. It was a cool and quiet Saturday night in the slow and sleepy town of Cooley. Thomas Mark Adams was a 17-year-old local resident of the small town in Davie County. Like many teenagers in rural areas, Thomas was bored and looking for something to do. He wanted to escape the boredom and monotony of the small town country life, but there was a problem. Thomas did not have any money, and he wanted to buy some marijuana to smoke and relax to enjoy his weekend. Thomas had recently learned new ways of making money, fast. Thomas was an experienced thief and burglar who had already committed several break-ins and thefts in order to fund his developing habit. He was arrested a few months earlier in the spring season for burglary and theft, and was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 15 weekends in jail. These legal punishments did not deter Thomas. He was willing to risk further consequences if it meant that there was a chance that he could score some quick cash for drugs. Thomas wandered the small town of Cooley prior, scoping out houses and potential victims that he could target. He battled his urges to commit crimes, but ultimately succumbed to his desires. He decided that he was going to break into a house that belonged to a 70-year-old woman. Mildred Hendricks Foster lived alone in her home in Cooley. Thomas noticed that the woman lived alone after witnessing her around the neighborhood and decided that her residence would be his next target. In his mind, it would be easier to rob her since she lived alone, believing that she may have expensive and valuable items such as jewelry or money stored away in the home. December 13th, 1987. Thomas began prowling the area of the residence, and at approximately 1:30 a.m. that late Saturday night, Sunday morning, he broke into her home. Armed with a large kitchen knife, Thomas entered through a window and began searching the rooms of the house. He crept around the residence, trying his best to search for anything valuable while trying to keep the noise down. After searching several bedrooms to no avail, Thomas decided to enter the master bedroom. Inside was Mildred Foster, sleeping soundly and comfortably in her bed. Thomas began to search Mildred's room, trying his best to remain quiet. After locating her purse on a dresser, he opened it and began searching her pocketbook. The sound of rummaging and the feeling of another presence in the room caused Mildred to wake from her sleep. She immediately started screaming at the top of her lungs, which caused Thomas to panic. Thomas shouted at Mildred and ordered her to stay quiet and that he was not there to harm her. She continued to scream and shout as loud as she could and quickly got up from her bed. She charged for the large kitchen knife on the dresser that Thomas had put down to search her purse. She swung the knife at Thomas several times in an attempt to defend herself from this intruder. Thomas tried his best to subdue her, grabbing her tightly and trying to restrain her while ordering her to stop and be quiet. During this struggle, Thomas put his hand over her mouth to silence her as he tried to retrieve the knife back from the woman. She bit his hand and continued to try and slash and stab Thomas in self-defense. Despite Mildred's best efforts to fight back, Thomas was able to pull the knife out of her hands. After regaining control of the large knife, Thomas stabbed the woman in her chest. Mildred continued to scream and cry at this point, with the large knife now lodged deeply inside her upper torso area. It was then that Thomas decided to quickly put her out of her misery, so he began repeatedly stabbing her in the chest multiple times with brute force. The woman screamed in agony and terror as this young man continued to stab her in her own bedroom. She fell to the floor and began losing large amounts of blood as she desperately tried to breathe and survive. Thomas realized that despite her multiple stab wounds, she was still breathing, and worried what to do next. It was then that Thomas put the knife to Mildred's throat and applied pressure against her neck while slashing open her throat and major artery. Mildred quickly bled to death, ending her cries for help in her own home. Thomas reached for the pocketbook in her purse that he was searching prior to her waking up and found $38 located inside. He stole the money and ran out of the house as fast as possible. Thomas returned to his home nearby in a state of shock and disbelief. He was not planning to murder anyone and thought that he could remain in control of his burglaries as long as no one woke up or discovered him. He became physically ill and began vomiting in his home, panicking. Covered in blood and washing his hands, Mildred's blood was stained on his hands and his conscience. Thomas may have been a thief and a criminal, but he was no murderer, at least not before tonight. A 70-year-old woman was murdered in cold blood, and Thomas knew that he would be caught and punished. He had a reputation already for stealing and breaking and entering, and knew that he would be eventually questioned and interrogated about this murder. He also couldn't stomach what he had just done, unintentional or not. After over an hour of contemplating what to do next, Thomas decided that he had to turn himself in to the police. At around 3 a.m., Thomas arrived at the Davie County Sheriff's Department, located 14 miles north of the town. Thomas had drove his own car to the station, drenched in the blood of his victim. When he arrived at the station, the sheriff's deputies and staff were shocked at what they were seeing. His clothes stained with Mildred's blood as Thomas cried hysterically, breaking down while confessing to his heinous crime. As the sheriff's deputies tried to calm Thomas down to learn what had happened, he kept referring to a poor old lady and that she did not deserve to die. Deputies then led him into the station and questioned him further about what had occurred. After calming down from his panicked state, Thomas informed the deputies that he had broken into a home earlier a few hours ago. He described the location and appearance of the house to the police and told them an elderly woman had lived there alone. Thomas then described in detail murdering the woman by stabbing her multiple times in the chest and slashing her throat open. The sheriff's deputies then proceeded to read him his rights as a juvenile and detained Thomas while thinking of what to do next. Thomas was already aware that any further statements could be used against him. However, out of fear and guilt, he agreed to give a voluntary statement and confession. The deputies told him that he needed to confess on paper and sign it in order to provide a voluntary confession. Thomas wrote in detail that he had stabbed Mildred 6 times in the chest before fatally slitting her throat in a brutal execution. After confessing to robbery and murder, Thomas was taken to a juvenile detention facility and was charged with murder. The horrifying murder sent shockwaves throughout the region. How could someone murder such a vulnerable person in such a terrible and brutal manner? Thomas's parents and family also could not believe this. His parents and siblings described Thomas as a shy and non-violent boy who preferred to keep to himself and loved animals. However, they did admit that Thomas had developed drug problems that year when he began experimenting with different substances. This led him down a path of crime to obtain his vice. After Thomas confessed to the murder, he was interviewed by 2 mental health experts, a psychologist and a psychiatrist, both within 24 hours of his confession. He was also examined and analyzed over the course of the next few weeks. Each mental health worker analyzed his mental state and personality, along with the details and testimony of what had occurred the night of the murder. One of them, Dr. John Warren, diagnosed Thomas with borderline personality disorder. Dr. Warren also testified in defense of Thomas, stating that he believed that Thomas was in a disorganized and unstable state of mind at the time, and that his thoughts became scrambled once he decided to commit an impulsive crime. Dr. Welwyn Rose, a psychiatrist, also diagnosed Thomas as suffering from borderline personality disorder and testified that he believed the stress and panic from the fight with Mildred defending herself caused Thomas to murder without thinking properly before acting. Thomas's relatives also defended him during questioning and testimonies, describing Thomas as a smaller boy for his age and that he related to children younger than him, possibly hinting that Thomas suffered from a learning or developmental disability. As the trial prepared, Thomas's attorneys argued that the teenager would not receive a proper trial in Davie County and requested that the trial be moved to a neighboring county for a more fair trial. This request was approved, and the trial was then moved to Iredell County after a successful petition from Thomas's legal representatives. Despite these efforts, Thomas did not receive any leniency in his trial. 1988. Thomas Mark Adams is found guilty on all counts and was convicted of first-degree robbery with a dangerous weapon, first-degree burglary, and first-degree murder. He was then sentenced to death. Thomas continued to appeal the conviction after sentencing, as his attorneys continued to search for any loophole in the case or trial, attempting to free the young man from being incarcerated and awaiting execution. Thomas received a glimmer of hope in 1994, after his 1988 guilty conviction was considered invalid and reversed. It was determined that the jury had been given incorrect and misleading instructions during the sentencing portion of his trial, which provided him with an opportunity of a retrial. There was a lot of political and social pressure around the time surrounding this case. It was well publicized in the local and state media at the time, and the controversial nature surrounding this trial and the conviction caused it to attract a lot of attention. There was a lot of pressure regarding holding this young man accountable for his actions, but there were also many people defending Thomas and argued that he should receive a proper chance at rehabilitation instead of being executed. 1995. Thomas is given the chance at a new and fair trial, with his defense attorneys strategizing a new plan for his defense. They attempted to use psychological reports and other various evidence and circumstances against the legal system in order to free their client. Still, Their efforts to prove that Thomas was not fully mentally capable of making a sound decision during a stressful situation were unsuccessful. Thomas Mark Adams is once again found guilty and convicted on the same criminal counts as before. He was once again sentenced to death. Thomas Mark Adams sat on death row for a decade, 10 long years awaiting his future execution, with no hope in sight. Yet in 2005, there was a sudden change of fate for Thomas. The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that the execution of juveniles was unconstitutional, and that anyone sentenced to death for a crime they committed as a juvenile would be pardoned from the death penalty. Since Thomas was 17 at the time of his crimes, he was saved from being put to death by the state of North Carolina. Thomas was one of the 7 inmates in total in North Carolina that were being spared the death penalty, and instead being ordered to serve a life sentence. 2015. Another decade passes after Thomas Adams was spared from execution. He was now eligible to approach the state parole board, and the Parole Commission Board needed to gather more documents and information before considering his release. The parole board contacted local media outlets near the area of the crime and was taking letters and information into consideration before deciding if Thomas should be released and given another opportunity at life. Over the course of his time in adult prison, Thomas had committed several infractions in prison, including drug possession, bribery of prison staff, theft, and weapon possession. The combination of all of these factors would ultimately influence the decision of the parole board when reviewing Thomas's situation. As of today, Thomas Mark Adams remains behind bars in North Carolina State Prison. He still continues to fight for his freedom, hoping for another chance at life after serving decades in incarceration. What do you think of the trial of Thomas Mark Adams? Do you believe he received a proper trial during his retrial? Do you believe that juveniles should be sentenced to death if they commit murder? And do you think that Thomas should receive parole and be released from prison? Let us know and comment below. Like, share, and subscribe for more.